All right, greetings, folks. Welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. What's been a pretty wild week, even really just honestly a wild couple of days. We will talk about what's going on in Alberta with the address from the Premier, a bad news budget, it seems like, coming next week, but the referendum coming in October. For now, there are actually 9 questions that Albertans are going to be asked. We'll talk about all of that. We've got a decision Friday from the U.S. Supreme Court striking down most of U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs. So what does that mean for Canada? And this whole uncertainty, this cloud of uncertainty around trade that hangs over us. We will later on, by the way, talk about China. And of course, with everything going on with the U.S., Canada has tried to look elsewhere for trading partners, trading opportunities. I mean, there was word this week about progress on a free trade deal with India. We also heard that maybe the Prime Minister in Canada is trying to be a bit of a bridge between the European trading bloc and the Trans-Pacific Partnership trading bloc. But yes, China is certainly front and center as Canada has reached out. The Prime Minister was in Beijing, of course. We have this tentative trade agreement with China where, we'll allow some electric vehicles to come in. They're going to lift tariffs on Canadian agriculture products. So it's somewhat modest in scope, but, Canada is looking elsewhere amid uncertainty with our U.S. partner, and China seems like an obvious one. Not just Canada, mind you. I mean, even the U.S. itself, despite Donald Trump's belligerence or threats about Canada getting closer to China, that's what he's trying to do. Right back in November, he announced a breakthrough, a trade deal with China on certain issues. He's planning on going to Beijing in April to try to build on that. So there has been a lot of focus. But China is still China. And all the issues around foreign interference and specifically transnational repression, that hasn't gone away. And there's a new report out from the Montreal Institute for Global Security that underscores that point. We'll get to that coming up later on. But let's dive into the news of the week and everything that's happened over the last couple of days, provincially, federally. Very pleased to welcome here to the program veteran political columnist based in Edmonton, Lorne Gunter, EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com. Lorne, thank you so much for making some time for us here.
Happy to be here.
My goodness, a lot to talk about. I guess we should touch on, amidst everything else, we've all been waiting for this tariff shoe to drop. The U.S. Supreme Court did indeed on Friday strike down many of Donald Trump's tariffs. I don't know, Canada's out of the woods, and who knows? Based on Trump's mood at his press conference, he might just double down on all of this. But I don't know, how significant do you think this is?
From a trade perspective and from a Canadian perspective, I'm not sure it means a great deal because, as you said, Trump has already said he's going to impose 10% more tariffs above and beyond what he already had imposed based on other laws in the United States. And so I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but it could take another year and a half to work its way through the legal system and have the Supreme Court strike all that down too. Yeah. But psychologically, I think this is a big victory. You have the world's biggest bully, and somebody just took away his bully stick. Yeah. He can't now. He shouldn't now. He may still go ahead and club people over the head with his bully stick. But he threatened anybody who did business with Iran with 25% tariffs. He threatened European allies with huge tariffs if they didn't give in to his demands on Greenland. He does this all the time on every issue because it is the biggest club he has. I don't think he's going to win much with charm. It's a big psychological victory, and the rest of the world gets to look at him and say, you lost.
Right. Which I'm sure just aggravates him further. I guess the thing here, look, it's not the U.S. Supreme Court has said tariffs are bad or tariffs are illegal. There's a process here which involves the U.S. Congress. I do wonder, Trump could just say, okay, here's legislation. Let's get Congress to pass new tariffs. I do wonder if maybe this is the out that a lot of Republicans have been looking for to say, okay, we went along with this for now. Now we've kind of got some cover here maybe to say, enough is enough here.
I think it's very perceptive. I think the other part of this is that they have midterm elections coming up in November. Right. Trump, who used to have coattails, now is an albatross. And so he can go to Congress and say, hey, give me power to set tariffs, but that's unlikely to happen. Not a majority. A lot of them will still give in to whatever it is he demands.
Sure.
But I think you're right. The more and more and more of them will say, look, if I stand with Trump, I'm losing my Senate seat, or I'm losing my House of Representatives seat. So I'm not going to stand with them anymore. And I'm going to stand up to him on this one. And, they passed in the House of Representatives a motion declaring the tariffs against Canada to be unwise.
Right.
It won't go very far in the Senate, but that'll give you an indication that I think the facade is starting to crumble, that Mr. Grumpy Face, is starting to lose it.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that all plays out. I think Canadians watching that closely. Certainly a lot going on here at home. Let's talk about what's going on in Alberta. I mean, we do have a budget coming next week, and it's, I think, going to be a kind of ugly and bleak budget. But, after this televised address Thursday night from the Premier, we're not really talking about the budget, right? We're talking about what's coming in 8 months, these 9 ballot questions, maybe more, depending what happens in the months ahead here. What do you make of where things are at and what the Premier has laid out here?
Well, first of all, I like most of her initiatives. I think that the questions that she wants asked are good ones. I think it's fair for a government to ask that of its electorate, to say, hey, how do you feel about immigration? How do you feel about standing up to Ottawa on these issues, like getting Ottawa out of provincial jurisdiction, but keeping the money? I mean, Quebec has done that for 40 years, and Ottawa has always gone along with it. But just watch. That's what Alberta's asking for. Alberta's now asking for the same thing Quebec's had for 40 years, but Ottawa will not grant it. So why not have a vote in October to see just how much support there is among Albertans for that kind of measure? And I think it's wise. But also, if you look at this, here's this 9-part referendum, probably going to be held at the same time as the Alberta Prosperity Project's separation referendum, and she's now just effectively swamped that.
Which is interesting. I mean, the separatists are even accusing her of sabotaging their vote. I mean, the idea that if this is muddied by 9 different ballot initiatives, maybe it's not really technically a clear question. I mean, they're not happy about all of this. I do wonder if to some extent they're frustrated because this could take the wind out of their sails if Albertans have other sort of valves to release frustration here, or, take more power, more say for Alberta, right? Does that hurt them?
I think that's it, is that this gives Albertans another out. They don't have to take the Thomas Lukasik route of, Canada is so wonderful and lovely, and we should all stay and be happy and dance in butterfly meadows and stuff. And then they don't have to go the Prosperity Project route, which is let's leave. There's this third way, and I think Smith has hit on it, that says we'll stay in Canada. We don't want to break up the country, but there are certain things that you do to us and certain things that we want to do for ourselves, and you have to respect that. And I think that could be a step towards an independence referendum 4 or 5 years from now, but it takes the wind out of the sails of the separatists.
I do wonder if there's the risk the longer term, and I think we saw it maybe to some degree with the equalization referendum, where Albertans vote and then nothing happens. And on some of these referendum questions, it's entirely incumbent on Ottawa acting or the rest of the country acting. Right? There's a high likelihood that Albertans will vote yes on some of these questions and nothing will happen. Does that not also maybe give ammunition to the separatists?
Well, that's what I said. In 4 or 5 years, this may lead to a nastier referendum, a referendum on real separation. But it gives people an outlet in the middle for this 2, 3, 4 years that they that they can take without having to go full separatist.
Is this the Premier now getting closer to, staking out a position here, and she's taken some flack for kind of being on the sidelines as the separatists to push their campaign. Or you've seen people like Jason Kenney and Stephen Harper sort of speaking up in defense of Canada or pushing back against the separatists. Are we getting some sense maybe of where the premier is going on this?
I think she's finally found a route that enables her to speak out firmly against Ottawa in a way that appeals to much of the UCP's base. And now she has this path forward. Prior to this, I think all she could see was either we must stay in Canada or we must leave. And there were an awful lot of UCP members. I mean, you remember when she went to the UCP convention in Calgary in January, she was booed for talking about, we have to try and work in Confederation and we need to build this pipeline. I think she felt she was stuck in the middle. And now I think she's found a middle way out of that. Look, let's look at those things that we want to be sovereign on within a united Canada.
Well, I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot of appeal, and you've even seen in some of the polls where those that are kind of soft separatists really just want more say or more autonomy, the idea that we're more in control of our destiny. Or, we see with federal elections, Alberta wants things to go one way, the rest of the country says, too bad, we're going this direction. There was, I think, a lot of appeal in some of that, right? Seizing control of some of these issues.
Well, and if you think Albertans were mad after the last federal election, just wait till the next federal election. Because if we have to go to the polls within the next year and a half, I'm predicting a Liberal juggernaut. I'm predicting over 200 seats for the Liberals to have a huge majority. And the reason for that is that Central Canada loves Mark Carney. And you can tell them till you're blue in the face that Carney has achieved very little, that all of his international trade agreements are mostly just agreements to agree to do another agreement at some point in the future. He hasn't stood up to Trump in the way that Canadians had expected him to. He was going to be the deficit cutter. He has packed up the deficit higher and higher and higher, and promises to do it for another 4 years. So to me, he's a huge disappointment. But he's not a disappointment in Central Canada where he looks and sounds like them. He's, the great suburban insurance salesman, insurance executive kind of guy. And that's what they're looking for. Also, I don't think Poilievre has much room to grow. Somebody asked me earlier today whether I thought with Matt Genereux leaving the Conservative caucus and going over to Liberals, whether Poilievre was in trouble. Not immediately, he's not. Because the only people who could oust him at this point are his party, and they're not going to do that. They like him. Yeah. But does he have room to grow among suburban voters? Does he have room to grow among Central Canadian voters? Can he win boomer support? No, and no. And so the one thing that will push him out before anything else is losing a second election, which unfortunately I think he's destined to do.
Yeah, I don't know if time is on his side. Maybe if the Liberals do kind of engineer a majority here, maybe that gives him a bit of a window to try to address these issues. But yeah, as you say, I think there's some challenges there for him. What did you make of the Matt Genereux thing, by the way? And look, I think you probably end up losing that seat whenever the next election is.
Yeah.
But what a weird episode where, he denies he's going to cross, then he says he's leaving politics, and then poof, he's a Liberal now.
He's leaving politics so he can spend time with his family who live in Victoria. And so he's not even a resident. He may have an official residence or post office box or whatever in Riverbend, but he lives in Victoria with his family. And so when that is better known, and the fact that he bugged out and went from the Conservatives to the Liberals in a fairly conservative riding, then I don't think he's got much chance of winning. I think when this happens, I think the convention in Canadian politics should be, if you decide you're going to leave one party for another, you have to step out of your seat and stand in a by-election so that your constituents have a possibility of passing judgment over your change, because you weren't elected as a Liberal. You were elected as a Conservative. And we know from study after study after study that Canadian voters vote for the leader first, the party second, and the local candidate way down the list. And so the local candidate shouldn't be allowed to switch from one party to the other because that's not what his voters decided based on. So I think he should have to step down, run in a by-election, and but whether he runs in a by-election or he runs in the next general election, I don't think he's winning.
Yeah, it's funny because I think governments tend to be the beneficiaries of floor crossing more often than not, and you need governments to implement that kind of law. So it's probably never going to happen.
Well, exactly. And if the Conservatives suddenly became the government, they could easily be the ones benefiting from floor crossings. So they're not going to say, "Oh no, we don't want new members. We don't need more people in our majority. You go and stand in a by-election." They're not going to do that. It's one of those things like proportional representation that opposition parties love because it would give them more seats. But as soon as they win a majority based on 41% of the vote, then no, we couldn't possibly do that. That's not Canadian.
By the way, it was interesting. The Western Standard, of all places, put out a poll this week showing that the Liberals are within 3 points of the Conservatives in Alberta, which was pretty shocking, and maybe that'll prove to be an outlier. Do you get any sense that the Liberals are gaining traction? It would seem to be in conflict with, the frustration in Alberta at Ottawa on federal policy. And I don't know, maybe the MOU or the potential of some pipeline progress, maybe that's a factor.
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's the case. Carney standing up to Trump to the extent that he has, for instance, with this new Without America trading alliance, I think that appeals to some people. And Edmonton is very left-wing, and not at the federal level. Most of its MPs are conservatives, but it is more to the left than anywhere else in the province. And Calgary is not the monolith that it once was. You of course have more NDP MLAs in Calgary now than you have UCP. And so long as the Conservatives and the UCP appeal more to a rural voter, I think there's going to be a lot of Calgarians who are looking for a more sophisticated urban party and candidate. And so, I could see, some of that. To look at that poll, I'd have to find out what was the regional weighting that, did they talk to 2 people in Lethbridge and 200 people in Calgary? There's a whole bunch of factors to that. But I do get a sense that there are some Albertans who are more open than they used to. But I drove down to Brooks, Alberta, in the southern part of the province last weekend, and I already saw one. You remember those bumper stickers that said F Trudeau? Well, I already saw one that says F Carney. So it hasn't taken long.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I do think, though, if we do actually get approval of a pipeline, I do think, especially if you want to look at the idea of taking the wind out of the sails of separatists, I think that's potentially a game changer. Look, there's a lot that goes into this. There's a long ways to go. How optimistic are you feeling about this?
Well, fairly optimistic. But my guess is that at some point in the process, the federal Liberals, in order to protect 20 seats or 25 seats in BC, have to find some way to say no. Because they're not going to elect 20 to 25 MPs now, even if the trends are changing in Alberta. They're not going to elect the same number of MPs here that they would select in BC or elect in BC. And there's nothing that motivates Liberals more than electoral calculations. They would kill every puppy in the country if they thought that would get them elected. So they're going to say, well, maybe we could get 4 or 5 seats in Alberta, but we would lose 15 in BC. So I think at some point they'll find a way to say, sorry, you haven't satisfied reconciliation and Indigenous people enough. You haven't done enough to take carbon out of the atmosphere. They're talking a lot about that now, but that also makes it possible for them to say in the near future, you simply haven't done enough, so we can't approve a pipeline.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you're right about seats, especially in Vancouver. I mean, at the same time, it seems like there's been a bit of a sea change when it comes to Canadians in general. You see a lot of support for these kinds of projects, even in BC. I think generally speaking, in BC, there's support for this. We see now projects moving forward with an Indigenous buy-in and
Mhm.
support. Do you think? I mean, how much do you think things have really actually changed versus where we're at even a few years
Oh,
ago?
I think they've changed quite a bit. I think people have begun to understand, outside of Alberta, people have begun to
Mhm.
understand that if you don't move resources to markets, then important social programs are at risk. Governments will perpetually be in deficits. So you have to move it, and jobs are at risk.
Yeah.
I looked at the job uh, pay uh, in Canada last week, because the Parliamentary Budget Office said that the average federal civil servant with salary, perks, pension, all that costs the taxpayer $143,000 a year. So I wanted to see if there was any other job category that even comes close. And the only ones that come close are mining and oil extraction. Nobody else has that kind of benefits packages or payment or any of that sort of thing. So that's where we're at, and people understand that. Well, I'm getting by on 65,000 a year in pay and perks, and if I want to see more than that, if I want to see my dollar stretch further to grocery store, whatever, I need to be in favor of these projects. And so I think that's where it's going. And also, big difference that Carney speaks in favor of these, as opposed to Trudeau, who never spoke in favor of
Yeah,
them.
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, they got to make a decision one way or another this year. I guess
Yep.
we'll have the referendums in October. Do you think now provincial, federal elections are more or less off the table this year?
Nope. Nope. As soon as the Liberals think they've hit the 200 seat mark and they're close, they pull a plug and they go. It's just the way they do it.
We shall see. Much more is mentioned. EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com. Lorne Gunter, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for
Hey, you
joining
bet,
me.
Rob.
All right. Our thanks again to Lorne Gunter, columnist for Postmedia, EdmontonSun.com, EdmontonJournal.com, as we kind of look to what awaits us in 2026. So, as the Alberta Premier announced, confirmed on Friday, Referendum Day, October 19th of this year. 5 questions related to immigration policy. Alberta taking more power as it pertains to immigration and even potentially limiting provincial benefits to certain newcomers. And then 4 questions on the constitutional side. Alberta trying to work with other provinces to push for constitutional change, including scrapping the Senate, provinces having more say over judges. And some of this is reasonable and doable. Some of it just seems kind of pie in the sky. It's going to be interesting to see how this all shakes out in terms of actual yes, no campaigns. I mean, is it just going to be the province campaigning for one side on these issues? Is the province just going to try to sort of portray itself as neutral arbiter here, that we're just raising awareness about these referendums? I mean, I think the people that are motivated to vote are those that already kind of agree with the premier and the government on these issues. So that's going to be a big focus. And I think to some extent it is a bit of a distraction and a scapegoat. I mean, it's interesting framing from the premier where, anything good that's happening in Alberta, that they get credit for that, but anything bad, that's all Ottawa's fault. Again, I think it's much more convenient to be talking about the failures of another government than to talk about your own. But I mean, look, we got a bad news budget coming. There's other issues too around healthcare and education. Don't forget, we got an Auditor General's report coming soon about that healthcare procurement scandal. So there's some domestic issues that I don't know that the premier is going to be able to deflect so easily and say, hey, look at what Ottawa's doing or not doing. But that's going to be a big focus. And we did touch on, of course, as well, the whole question of trade, and we'll see what happens in the aftermath of a pretty significant Supreme Court decision regarding presidential authority on tariffs. Donald Trump not taking too kindly to that ruling, and maybe he's just going to double down and try to impose tariffs different ways. So I don't know if we're out of the woods yet. And look, I mean, all of this uncertainty, as mentioned earlier, is one of the reasons why Canada's been looking elsewhere for trading partners. I think it makes sense to do so to diversify our trade, with Europe, with Asia, And look, India and especially China are major economies, and it makes sense to trade with them. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize, especially with regard to China, what it is we're dealing with. And let's just not memory hole everything that's come to light in recent years about foreign interference, and specifically on the issue of transnational repression. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's an interesting new report out from the Montreal Institute for Global Security that takes a closer look at this. To better frame what it is we're talking about here, why this is something we should be concerned about, and maybe why we shouldn't be naive about what it is we're dealing with when it comes to China. That yes, we do need to trade with China, but I think we need to recognize what it is we're dealing with. So you can read much more at migsinstitute.org. But joining us for more is one of the co-authors of this report, Phil Gurski. Spent 3 decades in Canadian intelligence. He's now a fellow with the Montreal Institute for Global Security, and he joins us here on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Phil, great to have you with us here.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
First of all, let's talk about what we mean when we talk about transnational repression. As the report says, it's kind of one of the least understood, but maybe one of the most serious issues of foreign interference and public safety threats that we face.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is no agreed upon definition, Rob, but I'm glad you raised the term foreign interference. Transnational repression, or TNR as it's known, is a subset of foreign interference. Now, we here in Canada have known about other types of interference from states. We saw the Hogue inquiry into Chinese meddling in our elections. We've heard about police stations, so-called police stations created on our soil to monitor and harass dissidents that are part of the Chinese Canadian diaspora. Transnational repression goes a little further, though. And what we mean by that is that it's not just harassment, it's actually threatening. So we get occasions where people are told, don't criticize the regime back home. You have relatives who are still here. They could be in trouble. In the worst case scenario, Rob, we've seen Canadians targeted and in at least case actually killed by a foreign state that was angry at the position they had taken with respect to events back in the homeland.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we just learned, with the Winter Olympics going on, there's a Chinese-American figure skater. As we learned, her family, and her in particular, they were subject to spying and harassment by agents of the Chinese state. So it's certainly not specific to Canada, but there is a track record here. What is the Chinese government's objectives when they engage in this sort of thing?
I think there's a couple of objectives, Rob. One is they obviously want to influence the government in Ottawa to adopt if not pro-China policies, but not adopt anti-China policies, whether it's with respect to trade or other issues that's happening in the People's Republic of China. What China seems to be very, very sensitive about is any criticism of what's happening in China. Especially, there's 3 things that they get very worried about. One is the situation in Xinjiang province, which is in China's northwest. It's a largely Muslim Uyghur population. And in truth, there have been terrorist attacks carried out by Chinese Uyghurs in China back in the 2010s. But what China did was they incarcerated more than 1 million people in that province in so-called re-education camps, which sounds so Marxist to me, Rob, from the days of the Cold War. And we have Uyghur Canadians who've called this out. We have Uyghur Canadians whose family have been incarcerated. And China doesn't like that. The second one are of course, in Tibet, where China is essentially eradicating Tibetan culture. Forcing Tibetans to attend Chinese language schools, lose their language, lose their ties to their ethnicity. And third, but not least, is Hong Kong. Of course, there's a pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong that's been completely crushed by China. And anytime they hear anybody calling out China for those policies, they get very angry. And then, of course, there's Taiwan as well, which is a bit of a separate issue. But bottom line is that China, under Xi Jinping, does not brook any criticism of its policies, either within China, within the region, or internationally.
One of the ways in which this is manifested has been these so-called police stations, which sort of have this official front of being like consular services, but I guess it's a way to monitor the diaspora community and have maybe that more physical kind of contact or intimidation. What role do these police stations play?
Well, as you said, the Chinese will say they're simply equivalent of consulates. Now, China has consulates all across Canada. I don't know how many they have, but I'm guessing at a minimum in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver being the 3 largest cities. Of course, a large Chinese diaspora in each of those cities. And what China says is, well, it's just a place for you to, renew your passport, renew your driver's license, et cetera, et cetera. What we found, though, and in part thanks to my former colleagues at CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, is in fact that they are monitoring the diaspora community for any elements of dissent. And these police stations are not registered as such. They're often held in sort of anodyne office blocks. They don't advertise themselves. But it's a chance for China to keep a pulse on who's who in the zoo in Canada and to basically establish who is being critical of the regime so that they can be contacted and warned, if you don't stop this criticism, harm may come to you and or your family back in China.
Now, those are maybe a little more visible elements of this, but I would imagine that a lot of this is probably tough to detect and difficult to monitor.
Largely because it's online. So
Yeah.
people get emails. I've heard cases, Rob, of especially women who've been sent AI-generated photos of them nude, saying they'll be sent to their families to act as an embarrassment, to act as a detractor, so they won't say things. Yeah, the online environment, as you're well aware, is extremely hard to monitor. It's just so vast in scope. And as a consequence, China knows that. So they're using this environment to threaten people in no uncertain terms that these types of activities, as I said, that are in any way critical of what's happening in China under the Xi Jinping regime will not be tolerated, and that people need to watch what they say and what they do.
Well, especially for Chinese Canadians who still have family back in China. I mean, Michael Chong, obviously member of parliament, is a high-profile example of that, where, his family members in Hong Kong were receiving threats. There were witnesses that didn't want to testify at the Hague inquiry because of those kinds of threats. So when there's family still back in China, what kind of leverage does that provide?
It's a dampening effect. If you, in fact, think, and let's face it, China will act on those threats. China is not a free liberal democracy like we are here in Canada, Rob. They're a communist dictatorship. And if you're, you have family back home and you've gotten a message saying, shut your pie hole about China or something will happen back, you don't have the luxury of determining if this is an idle threat or a serious threat. You have to take it seriously. And we certainly have seen cases. I've talked to Uyghur Canadians. In fact, a Uyghur Canadian was not a co-author of the report that Meigs wrote with. So myself and Maria Lamench, who are the authors, but he provided a lot of evidence of things that has happened to him. So if you want to get the word out, and I think people who are dissidents do want to do that, to draw attention to what China is doing, and you're told that if you do so, you may in fact place your family in danger, that makes you think twice. And in all honesty, I'm not sure how I would react, as I don't have, obviously I'm not Chinese Canadian, I don't have family back there, but it would make you reconsider, am I going too far? Is this so important that I'm risking my family, in some cases older members of my family, being incarcerated or held in very, very brutal conditions? So it does basically make people think very carefully about what they want to say in public for fear of harm to their families.
Yeah. Well, as you say, I mean, a lot of this has come to light through some of these various high-profile incidents, or even through the Hague inquiry itself and the broader picture of foreign interference. Should we be under any illusions here, Phil? I mean, the idea that this was all in the past or that anything significant has changed, is this all still very much present tense?
Absolutely. And I also want to add, Rob, I mean, the report we issue, we wrote it over a year, and it just came out this week.
Yeah.
This threat has been documented by CSIS for 40 years, ever since its creation. So CSIS, under its mandate, under its legislation, under 2B of the CSIS Act, it is mandated to investigate foreign interference. As I said, TNR is a subset of foreign interference. We've been warning the government about this for a very long time. And as we saw during the Hague inquiry, CSIS intelligence, especially about election interference, was simply ignored by the Trudeau government. We saw that intelligence was not read. It was not respected. It was sent back for rewording because it was sending an uncomfortable message. I mean, almost in a case, let's shoot the messenger on this one. So no, it's not a new phenomenon, and no, it's not going to end. And I think one of the concerns that I have, and many people with whom I worked in the security intelligence sector, I get trade with China. I get the diversification of our economy. Yeah. But if we're going to reset relations with China and not raise these issues about what's happening to Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kongers, we are essentially putting economic prosperity ahead of human rights. And I think as a Canadian who doesn't have a dog in this fight, I'm not Chinese descent, I'm very uncomfortable with the government saying, bucks are more important than people's lives. And so, yeah, it's not going to stop, because I think the government has decided that it is of secondary importance. The primary focus now is trying to develop trade with China so we can improve our economy.
That's the thing, and this goes much beyond, we'll buy electric vehicles, you buy canola. I mean, there's talk about security cooperation, this sort of thing. So, look, maybe the optimistic or naive perspective is that this will somehow regulate China's behavior, or they'll be on their best behavior to rehabilitate their image. But I think, the concern on the other side is that from a Canadian perspective, to maintain this relationship, maybe we go back to sort of looking the other way or downplaying this.
I want to bring something up, Rob. Back in the 90s, a lot of people were of the opinion that if we simply opened up to China and we traded with China, they would somehow become more like us. Right. They would become, if not a capitalist system, which they are to some extent, but they would throw off the communist yoke and they become more like the Western world. Now, how has that worked out? Well, certainly under Xi Jinping, it has not worked out at all. There was some, I think, hope in the 80s and 90s with certain leaders, but since Xi took over, it's been right back to the status quo ante under Mao. This is a communist dictatorship that is going to do what it wants. We could talk for days about their policies in the South China Sea, which it claims as its own, which is its international waters, its actions against Taiwan, actions against the Philippines, et cetera, et cetera. It bothers me that what I would consider to be pretty smart people thought that if we just trade more with China, everything's going to be okay. Now, it didn't work then. So my question to those people who still maintain this, what gives you the idea it's going to work now? So if we expand our trading relationship with China, why would you think that China is going to become better on human rights, not harass its neighbors, not put pressure on people when it didn't work then? I haven't heard an answer to that question just yet.
Well, I think part of this report is to help Canadians understand the scope of this and what's going on. But there's some advice here for policymakers too. What do you hope that the government takes from this?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they read the report. Like I said, Marie and I did a lot of research on not just China, but other nations that are carrying out TNR in Canada. It's quite a long list, including some countries you wouldn't have thought were engaged in it. And I think the bottom line for me, Rob, is as somebody, as you mentioned, I spent more than 3 decades in Canadian intelligence. One thing that myself and my former colleagues worry a lot about is our lack of an intelligence security culture here in Canada. We have very competent organizations. I worked for 2 of them, CSIS and CSE, Communications Security Establishment. We have National Defense, we have the RCMP, et cetera, et cetera. We have good people doing really good work to advise the government. And here's the problem. Intelligence agencies advise. They have no statutory function. They don't collect evidence. They don't make decisions. They don't create policies. They don't take any action. The problem, I think, that we've seen is that, especially if we want to narrow it to China specifically, we've been, as I said earlier, we've been providing this message for 40 years. And what was the immediate reaction of the Trudeau government when the report on Chinese interference was made public? CSIS is guilty of anti-Asian racism. Okay, first of all, that's ludicrous. Second of all, it shows how they failed to understand the intelligence that was being provided. So at a minimum, look, Rob, nobody's saying that CSIS is going to determine Canada's economic policy or foreign relations policy. All we're asking is that please take into account this very solid, corroborated, solid intelligence on what's happening and incorporate that into the decisions and policies that you make. I haven't seen that happen, and neither of my colleagues. So at a minimum, we have to do a much better job at developing a much more robust intelligence culture so that the information that is provided can be used in ways that advance Canada's interests, and at the same time recognize that there are certain human rights principles that we have signed up for decades, ever since the end of the Second World War.
Absolutely. Well, a timely and important report, Transnational Repression in Canada, much more at migsinstitute.org. Phil Gurski, appreciate your insight on this. Thank you so much for making time for us here.
My pleasure, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
All right, our thanks again to Phil Gurski, fellow at the Montreal Institute for Global Security, migsinstitute.org. Some important insights on China and foreign interference and transnational repression specifically. Also, our thanks to Postmedia columnist Lorne Gunter, again, edmontonsun.com, edmontonjournal.com. Certainly been an interesting and eventful week. I guess we'll see where things go from here. Have yourselves a fantastic weekend, folks. I'm sure plenty to discuss next week. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. And you can find this podcast on YouTube, on various audio podcast platforms. Again, have yourselves a fantastic weekend. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.